They built an empire the world could measure in dollars, but the people who loved him most measured it in tears. Paul McCartney didn't just leave behind wealth. He left behind weight, promises, sacrifices, and a quiet ledger of everything it cost to become unforgettable. And now, when we look at the staggering fortune attached to his name, we see not just numbers on a page, but echoes of a boy from Liverpool who once lost his mother too soon, who carried that wound into every melody he wrote, and who never stopped searching for a way to turn grief into music. The fortune itself is vast, estimated in the hundreds of millions, perhaps billions. But here's the contradiction. What looks like luxury to the outside world often feels like an unbearable burden behind closed doors. Mansions can be lonely. Royalties can echo with the voices of those who are no longer here. If you've ever stood in a room filled with relics of someone you loved, you know that strange ache. The more they left behind, the more you feel the absence. That is what makes Paul's story so piercing. His legacy is more than money. It is weight. But here's where it gets complicated. Before there was any fortune, before there were songs that circled the globe, there was the quiet shadow of loss. Mary McCartney, Paul's mother, died when he was just 14. Imagine a damp Liverpool night, the smell of coal smoke in the air, the thin curtains in the small family home drawn tight. Inside, a boy with dark hair sits at the kitchen table, staring at the empty space where his mother used to move. That absence would become his first scar, shaping not just his music but his hunger, to hold on to life, to create something lasting, to prove that love, once lost, could be kept alive in song. The house itself was modest. Brick walls that carried every echo, a staircase that creaked with each careful step. In the kitchen, the cold linoleum pressed against bare feet in winter. These details mattered because they were the textures of Paul's early world, the world where dreams were not guaranteed and where loss arrived suddenly, without explanation. His father, Jim, tried to hold the family together. A trumpet player himself, Jim would sometimes coax Paul to the piano, nudging him toward melody, reminding him that even in grief there was music. But Paul, at that age, felt both gratitude and resistance. Music was an escape, yes, but it was also a reminder of what his mother would never hear. The ache of absence followed him everywhere. At school, he'd catch himself turning to tell his mother something, only to remember she wasn't there to hear it. At night, he'd wake to the sound of his father's muffled crying through the thin walls. The working-class neighborhood of Speke, with its identical brick houses and narrow streets, seemed both suffocating and empty. There were days when even breathing felt like an act of forgetting. How could he continue when she could not? It was then that music began to take on a different shape in his life. No longer just entertainment, it became a vessel, something that could hold what words alone could not. That wound never really healed. Instead, it became fuel, and if you listen closely, you can still hear it. In the tenderness of Let It Be, inspired by a dream of his mother's voice telling him to find peace. In the ache of Yesterday, a song that came to him fully formed, as if whispered from beyond. In the sweeping optimism of Hey Jude, written to comfort John Lennon's son Julian during his parents' divorce, but in truth, carrying Paul's own longing to soothe the wounds of children everywhere. These weren't just songs. They were coded letters to his past, ways of carrying his family with him. But the boy who played a cheap guitar in Liverpool pubs could not have known that those songs would someday build an empire big enough to sustain generations, and heavy enough to haunt them too. Think of him at 16, fingers calloused from practicing chords until his fingertips bled, learning to play left-handed on a right-handed guitar because that's all they could afford. Think of him walking through Woolton on a summer day in 1957, nervous but determined, to meet a boy named John Lennon, who played in a skiffle group called the Quarrymen. John, already 17, cocky and wounded in his own way, his mother Julia having abandoned him to be raised by his Aunt Mimi, only to die in a traffic accident just as they were reconnecting. Two boys, marked by maternal loss, finding in each other what they couldn't find alone, a language for their pain, a brotherhood forged in the crucible of shared wounds. Their early days were hardscrabble, playing in basements, working men's clubs, the backs of vans, the smell of beer-soaked floorboards and cigarette smoke clinging to their clothes as they hauled equipment through Liverpool streets at midnight. Think of them in Hamburg, playing 8-hour sets in strip clubs on the Reeperbahn, fueled by Preludin pills to stay awake, sleeping 5 to a room behind a movie screen. The glamour would come later, but first came the grind, the hunger, the need to prove something to the ghosts that followed them. And that's when everything changed. The Quarrymen became the Beatles, and the Beatles became the most famous band in the world. For Paul, the leap was dizzying. One day he was playing skiffle tunes for a handful of friends. The next, he was on stages where the roar of the crowd was so loud he couldn't hear his own voice. Fame arrived like a tidal wave, sweeping away privacy, innocence, and normalcy. Yet, at the heart of it all was still that boy from Liverpool, carrying his scar like a hidden compass. But fame was not free. There were nights Paul couldn't sleep for the sound of screaming crowds still ringing in his ears. There were arguments over money, control, ownership, things that no boy from Liverpool ever dreamed of. There was the slow erosion of friendship, as fame bent and twisted even the tightest bonds. Paul was often portrayed as the perfectionist, the taskmaster, the one who pushed the band forward. And maybe he was, but beneath the drive was fear. The fear of stopping, the fear of losing it all, the fear of silence creeping in again. Consider the cost of becoming an icon. The endless hotel rooms, identical in their anonymity, beige walls, heavy curtains, the smell of other people's cigarettes lingering in the carpet, the pressure of producing hit after hit, of outdoing yourself with each album, the strange unreality of being loved by millions but truly known by few. There were days when Paul would look in the mirror and barely recognize the face staring back, the eyes a little more guarded, the smile a little more practiced. Fame had reshaped him, cell by cell, into someone both more and less than the boy who lost his mother. As Beatlemania consumed them, as records broke and tours expanded, as their faces appeared on lunchboxes and bubblegum cards, something more private was happening. Paul was learning to navigate wealth. It came in waves. First the modest royalty checks, then the torrent of merchandising deals, movie contracts, publishing rights, money that could fill the emptiness, or at least paper over it. Money that could buy security his family had never known. But also money that came with questions. Who deserves it? Who controls it? What happens when artists become businesses? The mythology often portrays the Beatles' breakup as a clash of egos, a creative divorce. But beneath the surface ran deeper currents. The death of their manager Brian Epstein in 1967, leaving them rudderless. The formation of Apple Corps as a tax shelter that became a money pit. The arrival of Alan Klein, the accountant who would drive the wedges between them over financial control. Paul fought to protect what they'd built, perhaps too controlling, perhaps too rigid, perhaps too afraid of losing everything. But in his defense, he'd lost enough already. Now, if you're wondering how that sound turned into fortune, the answer lies in resilience. Paul reinvented himself again and again, from Beatle to solo artist to leader of Wings. Each reinvention carried costs. Late nights away from family, pressure to outdo the past, critics ready to dismiss him. But he kept going. He kept writing. He kept investing. He treated songs not just as art, but as seeds, each one capable of growing into a forest that would outlast him. And slowly, the fortune grew, not just in royalties but in rights, in publishing, in real estate, in the countless instruments that became artifacts of eras. Think of him in the aftermath of the Beatles, facing the collapse of everything he'd built, the lawsuits, the depression, the retreat to his farm in Scotland where he and Linda raised sheep and children, far from the spotlight, the critics who called his solo work lightweight, saccharine, a pale shadow of his Beatles output, the humiliation of being rejected by record labels who once would have given anything for a McCartney song, the nights when he'd sit at the kitchen table drinking scotch, wondering if he'd peaked at 28, if the rest would be footnotes and nostalgia. But he rebuilt, song by song, album by album, tour by tour. The formation of Wings with Linda by his side, not because she was a virtuoso musician, but because he couldn't bear to leave her behind again. The slow climb back to commercial success with Band on the Run, recorded in Lagos, Nigeria, amid political turmoil and armed robbery. The gradual restoration of his name, his confidence, his place in the culture, and all the while the fortune grew. Real estate acquisitions, smart investments, the prescient purchase of publishing catalogs, including famously the Buddy Holly collection, that would become more valuable with each passing year. The empire he built is breathtaking. There are London townhouses where polished wood still carries the smell of old varnish, each step echoing with the shuffle of visitors who once came to listen. A Scottish farm where the earth remembers his boots, trudging through mud with sheepdogs at his side, far from the glare of cameras. Homes in the U.S., filled with art collections, private rooms where songs were drafted in notebooks, rare guitars, some scuffed, some pristine, that tell the story of decades in 6 strings. But wealth always pivots to weight. These are not just possessions. They are responsibilities, insurance policies, trust funds, the livelihoods of staff and families tethered to his name. To the world, they are assets. To those close to him, they are reminders of the life it took to gather them. His art collection alone speaks volumes. Works by Magritte, Picasso, Renoir, de Kooning, not randomly acquired but carefully chosen, each piece reflecting something of his own aesthetic journey. The Magritte that inspired the Apple Records logo, the surrealist works that echoed his own experiments with dream imagery and songs, the impressionist landscapes that captured something of the English countryside he loved, each painting worth millions, each one carrying the weight of preservation, insurance, eventual decisions about where they belong when he is gone. The real estate portfolio spans continents. The townhouse in St. John's Wood, just steps from Abbey Road Studios where it all began. The farm in Scotland where he retreated after the Beatles' breakup, where he raised his children away from the madness of fame, where sheep grazed in fields overlooking the Mull of Kintyre that would inspire one of his biggest hits. The properties in East Hampton, in Beverly Hills, in Arizona. Places of refuge, yes, but also investments, tax considerations, complex holdings that require management, maintenance, decisions. The caretakers, the gardeners, the security personnel, all sustained by his wealth, all part of the ecosystem his success created. And behind those assets was cost. Nights of grief after losing John Lennon in 1980, when Paul sat in stunned disbelief, unable to process that his partner, his friend, was gone forever. The hollow quiet after Linda's death in 1998, when Paul once more sat at the kitchen table staring at an empty chair. He had built so much, but even the grandest estates could not shield him from the human truths. Love is fragile, and time is merciless. The fractures with friends, the relentless pressure to keep the McCartney name unblemished, the endless expectations, these were the hidden taxes on his wealth. Think of him in the days after John's murder, the cameras tracking him as he left his home, the microphones thrust in his face, the world demanding a performance of his grief. "It's a drag, isn't it?" he said, words that seemed callous to those who didn't understand the British understatement masking devastation too deep for public display. Behind closed doors, friends said, he collapsed. The loss wasn't just personal, it was the final death of a dream, the certainty that the Beatles would never reunite, that the brotherhood was irretrievably broken. All the money in the world couldn't buy back that possibility. Or think of him in the hospital room with Linda, watching cancer steal her by inches. The woman who had been his anchor through the storm of the Beatles' breakup, who had given him 4 children, who had taught him about vegetarianism and animal rights, who had been not just wife, but co-creator, photographer, bandmate, business partner. No fortune could slow the cancer cells multiplying in her breast, spreading to her liver. No amount of privilege could soften the moment when her breath stopped, when the room fell silent, when Paul McCartney, one of the most famous men on the planet, became simply a widower, as vulnerable as any grieving husband. Yet through it all, there was love, anchors that steadied him. Linda's devotion, his children's laughter, the grounding force of music itself. In family photographs you can see it. Paul in muddy boots on the farm, children clambering around him, Linda behind the camera capturing not the star, but the man. These were the moments he lived for, the quiet hours away from the stage lights. But even love came with its fractures, disputes over inheritance, the strain of public life, the ever-present question of how to protect the legacy without losing the intimacy of family. His children grew up in the strange half-light of tremendous privilege and tremendous scrutiny. Imagine being Stella McCartney, arriving at school where other children had Beatles lunchboxes with your father's face. Imagine being James, trying to find your own voice as a musician while critics inevitably measured you against one of the greatest songwriters of all time. Imagine being Mary, named for the grandmother you never knew, carrying that echo in every introduction. Imagine being Heather, Linda's daughter whom Paul adopted as his own, navigating the complexities of blended family in the public eye, and later Beatrice, his daughter, with second wife Heather Mills, born when Paul was 60, growing up amid a bitter divorce played out in tabloid headlines. For them, the McCartney fortune is not abstract. It is the water they've always swum in, the air they've always breathed. It shaped their childhoods in ways both obvious and subtle. The security details that followed them to school, the knowledge that their birthday parties might appear in magazines, the awareness that their father's name opened doors but also attracted those with agendas. It meant elite education, startup capital for their own ventures, networks of influence most can only dream of. But it also meant living in the shadow of an icon, the pressure to prove themselves worthy, the suspicion that friendships might be based on proximity to fame rather than genuine connection. The question of inheritance looms large, not just the money, though that alone is complex enough, but the rights, the royalties, the control of the catalog. Who will manage the McCartney legacy? Who will decide which commercials can use "hello," "goodbye," which films can feature "live and let die," who will negotiate with streaming services, with biographers, with documentary filmmakers? These are not just business decisions. They are custodial ones, choices that will shape how future generations encounter the work. And within those choices lie potential conflicts, competing visions, the pull between preservation and evolution. And so we arrive at the question of legacy. What happens to a fortune like Paul McCartney's when it becomes inheritance? Who can carry the weight, not just the wealth? Is legacy a blessing, or is it in some ways another wound to carry forward? These are the questions his family will face, and in them we glimpse the universal truth. Every estate is both a gift and a burden. To inherit Paul's songs, his catalog, his wealth, is to inherit his scars, his unfinished work, his unspoken promises. Consider the mechanics of such a transfer, the trust funds, the tax implications, the careful structuring to preserve as much as possible for the next generation. The meetings with solicitors, financial advisors, estate planners, all focused on the question, how do we protect this fortune from dissolution? But beneath the technical details lie deeper concerns. How do we honor the spirit that created it? How do we ensure the money doesn't distort the very values it's meant to sustain? How do we prevent inheritance from becoming entitlement? For some heirs to vast fortunes, the weight becomes crushing. There are the cautionary tales throughout history, the third-generation wealth that dissolves into addiction, aimlessness, the peculiar emptiness of having everything yet contributing nothing, the children who rebel against privilege by rejecting it entirely, or who become defined by their relationship to money they didn't earn, the siblings who speak to each other only through lawyers, fighting over interpretations of wills, over who most embodies the legacy, over who was loved most by the departed. But there are also stories of inheritance as stewardship, of wealth used not just for comfort, but for continuation of values. McCartney's own philanthropy points the way. His support of music education, animal rights, environmental causes, humanitarian relief. His children have each in their own ways taken up aspects of this mantle. Stella with her pioneering sustainable fashion line, Mary with her vegetarian cookbook and photography that often highlights social causes, James with his own musical journey that honors his father's while finding new territory. In their hands, the McCartney fortune might become not just passive wealth but active legacy. If his story were only about money, it would be a ledger. But Paul McCartney's story is about resilience, about the courage to take childhood loss and transform it into melodies that carried millions through their own grief. His fortune is not just in banks and estates. It is in the nights you listened to Blackbird and felt hope. It is in the mornings you played Here Comes the Sun and felt new beginnings. It is in the funerals where Let It Be was sung as a prayer, in the weddings where Maybe I'm Amazed was played as a vow. His true wealth is scattered in our lives like seeds that continue to bloom. Think of how his music travels, across generations, across cultures, across circumstances. The teenager learning Yesterday on a first guitar, the couple who danced to My Love at their wedding 50 years ago, still holding each other close when it plays. The activist drawing courage from Revolution, the mourner finding solace in The Long and Winding Road. Songs that have become part of our emotional landscape, as familiar as our own memories. This is wealth that can't be counted, can't be divided, can't be inherited by just a few, because it already belongs to all who need it. And here is the final contradiction, the one that brings us full circle. The boy who lost his mother created works that now mother us in our own moments of loss. The empty space at the kitchen table became songs that fill empty spaces in millions of lives. The pain that could have silenced him instead became a voice that refuses to be silenced, even after he is gone. What begins in absence ends in abundance. What starts as private wound becomes public healing. This is the true alchemy of art, not the transformation of talent into money, but the transformation of sorrow into joy, of endings into beginnings, of silence into song. And so, we close not with numbers, but with gratitude. Paul McCartney leaves behind more than music, more than money. He leaves behind proof that art can turn pain into something beautiful, that loss can become melody, that silence can become song. If his work ever carried you through a hard season, consider leaving a small tribute below. Even a single like is a whisper of gratitude. His legacy reminds us, wealth fades, but the weight of love, song, and memory endures.